the topic of this is leading into the unknown future. It's redundant. The future by definition is unknown. Sorry. And in fact, because the future is always changing, right? When I was in grad school, I had a class with Paul Ricoeur, not to be kind of call names, but the president of France was his research assistant. We had a class on a kind of issue of what we called Vergangenheit Zukunft, which we kind of jokingly translate as the future isn't what it used to be. And think about that. If we were having this conversation 4 years ago, some of the things that are on your mind today probably would not be as preeminent as they were then, right? If we were having it 16 months ago, the things that you were thinking about in the near term, if not, or the midterm, probably would be different than they are today. So the topics and the future itself is there, and indeed, the very nature of the question of a knowable future has exercised thinkers in our tradition for centuries, from arguments over astrology and whether the stars had any influence over Israel, to the Bavli that basically says, Abraham said before, I looked at my astrological map, and according to the configuration of my constellations, I am not fit to have a son. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, emerge from your astrology, as the verses state, and he brought him outside. There is no constellation for Israel, right? The future is what we make. And if we think about the fact that the future is something we create it perhaps from pre-existing material. Won't talk about kind of issues around that in Bereshit. We have some control. Now, at the same time, it's not unimportant to kind of acknowledge that Judaism and the Jewish people themselves have always been addressing and moving into uncertainty and relative openness to the future, and the faith that the promise that we have, the purpose that we're here to serve, is something we move into. Avraham leaving his land and going to Canaan. Moshe leading the people through the wilderness. The sages rebuilding Judaism after the destruction of the temple. And in fact, Judaism reinventing itself in every era. The openness of the future, as I said, means that it's something we create, we make. Most definitely, as I said, we make it in response to emerging events, to known facts in the present, but also in response to things over which we could not, or at least reasonably could not have anticipated. So flexibility has to be there, the recognizing that there, but what are the strengths that we can build into our institutions that make it possible for us to respond? But what I want to emphasize going forward to some extent is we really need a strong purchase on current reality in order to kind of navigate the future successfully. And what I want to say, to kind of on the positive note, is that the tradition has within it answers and responses to the challenges that we're facing in society and in culture, right? Now, in doing so, I may make an argument that runs against the grain of some of the conversations earlier today, namely to kind of invite you to think about that the issues you were invited to address in the implementation exercise, while real challenges for all of our institutions, are not the problem. And in fact, they're merely symptoms of the problem. And unless we focus on the illness as well as its symptoms, regardless of how successful we may be at treating the symptoms, we may be unable to find the cure. Now, as an historian, I'm always kind of inclined to look down my nose over my glasses and say, it really isn't new, you know, because this challenge of addressing realities is not new. Think about when the first Jews came to British North America or the United States. What did they find here? Not Judaism. They had to create it. They had to make it. They had to sustain it. What does it look like in a place that has no kind of pre-existing statement of who you are, where you can go, what you can do, right? The response to the novelty of the United States is something that every tradition who came here had to address because it wasn't here before they got here, right? So this is, I will argue, has been occasioned by the ongoing need to confront what I think is a preeminent marker of modernity and something we have to address very, very seriously, and that's the ability to choose. As modernity spread and deepened, the power of ascriptive identities, the identities that were given to us and we could not, for all intents and purposes, change, ascriptive identities weakened. And in many ways, I will argue this occurred in the United States, at least in terms of religious practice, much more readily in the rest of the world. And I will argue that in many ways this has been positive for religion, and particularly for Jews in the United States. For once religious identity becomes a matter of individual or familial choice, that means to have it, you have to create it. You have to do something, it has to become yours. Religious and communal institutions were something that had to be created by each new group that comes to the United States. What did we do? Everybody who comes here modeled their institutions, their way of being in the world on people that look successful, right? This is where, and so basically everybody in the United States is a Protestant. Doesn't matter whether you're a Hindu, a Catholic, Jew, everybody in terms of kind of their institutional structures had to be or Protestants did. Religion is a matter of choice and something you create. And also you did it within what the legal structures in the United States allowed, which was very different than what people had in Europe. So this level, there's this ability to kind of, in fact, a forced need to kind of create your own religious institutions led to a kind of level of commitment and activity in the U.S.'s religious and communal landscape that kind of caused us to really outstrip the realities in Europe today. But it also created what I think a reality that may have led to a crisis situation for American Jewry. Because once religious and communal identity becomes a matter of choice, then institutions often become driven to operating under a consumer or market model. Congregates and community members become consumers. As a result, institutions must find increasing ways to entice them to buy your product. Now, apparently, until recently, and a slight caveat with events after October 7th and increasing anti-Semitism, and this may be a new thing, but until recently, and those may be additions to this, there were countervailing forces that limited the total victory of the consumer model. And this even kind of came up in the exercise today, the kind of role of tradition in the decision-making, right? Lingering cultural anti-Semitism, the Shoah, social and familial norms that expected, if not demanded, at least a nominal connection with Judaism and Jewish communal institutions. Whether kind of membership in a synagogue, oh God, I've got to give to the Federation because my daddy did, or whatever. But the diminution of those forces, however, as I will argue, has led to increasing dominance of the consumer model to the extent that almost any conversation of the future of Jewish communal institutions, Jewish continuity, etc., leads to issues, all right, here's where I get in trouble again, of meeting folks where they are and giving them what they want. Two examples. About 10, 12 years ago, I was in Jerusalem. I was at the Jewish People's Policy Institute and talking to one of their researchers completely there for something totally disconnected. I was actually there to talk about interfaith organizations in Jerusalem, guys of Velvet Kippah in France, and also to talk about Jewish Sufis, another question entirely. But in the middle of our conversation, he says, stop, I want to ask you a question. Okay. He says, I've been tasked with the Prime Minister's office to come up with a series of projects or programs for what the state of Israel can do with Jews in the diaspora. What do you think that is? What should those be? I said, are you asking me, dude? So I began to talk. Well, the whole point is institutions to be successful have to give people positive reasons for being Jewish, have to kind of have this kind of substance. Back to kind of the book The Jew and the Lotus, when the group of Jews go visit the Dalai Lama, and they say, hey, all these Jews are kind of becoming Buddhists, what do you do? And the Dalai Lama says, look, I'm not doing anything. They're coming to me. You've got this tradition, why haven't you given it to them? So I'm kind of going on, because, hey, you get what you pay for, I can say whatever I want. But halfway through, he stops me, and he says, I have been asking this question of Federation leaders, rabbis, communal leaders across the board from the US, you're the only person who's ever talked about substance. There's maybe your problem, dude. Same thing, right? I teach an adult ed class at the Brill Institute. So before class last week, I kind of asked my students, people care about Judaism, they're taking classes, been in the Jewish world their entire lives so far. I said, all right, what do you want me to talk about? Everyone talked about the same thing. You've got to bring the young people in, you've got to, Jewish continuity, you've got to make it fun, right? Everybody's concerned about bringing people in, and there are lots of ways to do that. We all do that. The question is, what do we give them once they're there? Now, I don't want to reject this perspective out of hand. But I must ask, can that truly be the answer? Can our communal institutions ever meet the fun quotient of movies, theater, sporting events, etc.? Can the demand that the tradition has for attention to text, the hard work of maintaining and growing communal institutions, of experiencing Shabbat, can we ever win at fun? Right? For some of us, maybe. But think about it. If not, then what do we provide? So my argument today is that the substantive nature of the Jewish tradition in all its complexity and all its richness provides something much greater than fun and something that our society needs, namely the creation and maintenance of meaning and identity. The tradition can provide and create meaning for individuals and offer ways through which individuals can express it. Additionally, and this is where I think what we have to offer to kind of the pressing social and cultural problems is really an opportunity rather than a challenge. Identity along with meaning can provide a powerful response to what I think are some of the most troubling contemporary challenges, the realities to which Jewish and communal institutions not only must respond, but indeed have the answer, or at least an answer, to the needs of the moment, and that by making the tradition in all its depth the center of our work, we can address in the midterm, because as Kane said, in the long term we're all dead, the challenges you were invited to respond to in that exercise. So why? Right? So I want you to think about moving to the future in terms of what we offer to some pressing cultural realities. The first, I'm going to ask you to think about in just a minute, is how would you define success for your institution in the next 10 to 12 years? The other are cultural realities, the decline in trust of institutions, the rise in loneliness, significant life cycle changes. What I want to kind of talk about, kind of what's the nature of religious authority, financing, Israel, anti-Semitism, and what's the role of pluralism? So the first question, as I said, I want you to reflect upon is what would you consider success to be for your organization 10 to 15 years from now? And I want to give you a few minutes to reflect on that. Because the first claim I want to make is that success cannot and is not and should not be understood as one thing. What it should not be, however, is mere institutional survival. Certainly you cannot be successful if you don't survive, but mere surviving is not success, right? Both my table and one of the others basically suggested that at least entertain the possibility sometimes of institutional euthanasia. If all you're doing is trying to keep yourself alive, why are you alive? So what's success? That's rhetorical. I'm not going to make you kind of answer that question. But think seriously. How would you define success for your organization? Because there are lots of ways to consider and define success. I'll give you a perfect example of success that most of us on one level would think about failure. So in the early to mid 70s, a group of fairly successful evangelical Christian ministers undertook a kind of shared activity of reading the so-called ante-Nicene Fathers. It's basically Christian writers before the Nicene Creed. And as they went through this process, they basically convinced themselves that Orthodox Christianity, Greek Orthodoxy, Antiochian, Syriac Orthodox Church, whatever, that Orthodox Christianity was the actually correct understanding of the tradition, and they increasingly moved in the direction. Now they're actually affiliated with the Syriac Antiochian Church of North America. One of the leaders of that group had a 2,000-member congregation in Chicago. His congregation now consists of 30, right? Is he successful? He thinks he is, because now he's able to teach what he thinks is true Christianity. But if we think about success as just numbers, probably a losing game. Now, I don't want to say everybody go in that direction, hey, what do we do with whatever happens? But I want you to think about the fact success can be lots of different things. And how you define success or how your community defines success for your organization is not unimportant. Secondly, and I think this was an interesting thing that kind of came up in the exercise, do we even know what we're being successful at? Right? We may know what we're not, quote unquote, successful at being, but do we actually know what we actually are accomplishing? And I'm going to say the nasty E word, but I'm going to explain it different ways. How do we evaluate our programs? Most of us think about evaluation as judgment. This is working, this isn't working. We have this many people, we're going down, we're going up, money's not coming in, money is coming in. But believe it or not, there actually is a form of evaluation, which I hate the name of because it goes against everything I believe in the name, though the process is, it's called value-free evaluation. It basically says, let's go in and see what's actually happening in our organization. Where are the things that actually we may be accomplishing that we hadn't anticipated we were, right? That we may have thought that what we really, really needed to be doing was X, and we may be accomplishing Y, right? We may want, and perhaps think it's a legitimate want, people to be in the sanctuary during services, but what we're really successful at is building a kind of community in kind of different formats during Shabbat, right? And it's interesting when you think about it. I have colleagues about 10, 12 years ago did a piece on Toynbee Hall. Toynbee Hall is one of the first settlement houses in London. Toynbee Hall was created in 1880, roughly. The subtitle of the article was A Perpetually Failing Institution. Because if you basically took Toynbee Hall by any kind of category of a successful nonprofit, the amount of money, the thing is just a complete bust. But it's been a complete bust for over 120 years, right? Why? Because it serves as a kind of anchor institution to the poor community. It's there for people all the time. They need it. It actually holds the group together. So sometimes what we think is success may not be, and sometimes what we overlook may be successful. So that, how do we understand success? And this actually also came out in the conversation, is because actually there are innumerable goods out there that could be served by synagogues and Jewish communal institutions. Not only is JF&CS different from JKG, from Chabad of East Cobb, from Congregation Beit Chavarim. Sunday school here at Temple Sinai is different from JKG. Both of the latter may be committed to enhancing Jewish education among children, but they reflect innumerable differences, from population to location to orientation. To turn your organization to another simply because the other one is more successful in a quantitative sense of the word, I will argue, maybe reject your values and purposes. But as we talked about, and that's why I really like the fact everybody kind of brought up the kind of what's the mission statement of the synagogue, because our organization should exist for a purpose, maybe even purposes. But, as Ira suggested, this purpose must be an extension both of what we value and our values. There should not be a disconnect between what we claim to value and the purposes your organization spends its time meeting. And this is nothing new to anybody. Most extreme, my fundamental argument is that the key to organizational flourishing in the future is to find ways to be unabashedly Jewish. Rather than fear, we need courage. Instead of the general, we need particular. If we are Jewish organizations, we need to be clear about what makes us Jewish. As a former agriculture secretary of Texas used to say, Jim Hightower, the only thing in the middle of the road is yellow lines and dead armadillos. Or in the words of the Kotzker Rebbe, a horse walks down the middle of the road. A human being, on the other hand, sticks to one side or the other. The only question is, what side? Now, I don't want to take it this means to be insular or even exclusionist. It does mean that given all the options people have, especially in engaging with our organizations, whether it's synagogues, human and social service organizations, but also in terms of their donative activities, what separates Jewish organizations from others? We may have done a wonderful job in federations teaching folks to give, but arguably have we done a good enough job teaching them to give to Jewish organizations? Now, even when we get people in the doors, how do we keep them there? As the fundraising aphorism says, people buy the steak, but you sell the sizzle. My claim today is that for too long we've been selling the sizzle, but once folks arrived at the barbecue, there was no steak. So what do we have to do? What do we have to offer to kind of cultural challenges? First, I think we have to acknowledge that there's been an overall decline in trust of all organizations and all institutions in the United States. No major institutional cohort in the United States has a trust factor over the mid-50s, right? NGOs, business, government, the media, nobody has a trust ratio over 50%, over 55%, right? And this trust factor kind of changes based on kind of age. Younger people are less trusting. Income, people of lower income are less trusting. Now, Edelman Trust Barometer kind of tracks this from year to year. They quit tracking religion in 2021, but Brian Berges at Eastern Illinois University actually continues. And basically, there's been an overall decline in trust in religious institutions in the United States. Only 15% of people in the United States express a great deal of confidence or trust in religion, right? While those who kind of express distrust, have little or hardly any trust in religious institutions, has basically risen to 15%, right? What do we do to kind of rebuild that trust? Any attempt to create a flourishing environment for our institutions, we have to think about what role do we play in getting our stakeholders to trust us. This is an institutional level, it's a local level, and across the board. Where have and where do we continue to fail, and to kind of ensure that we're worthy of people's time, energy, and monies? Second is questions of identity and meaning. Synagogues and other Jewish institutions to flourish in the future, it's essential, I will argue, that they focus on the question of identity and meaning, both their creation and maintenance, as well as providing places where people can express it. And focusing on those components, your organizations, our organizations, can and will be addressing some of the most pressing challenges in the United States. First, the epidemic of loneliness. As we all know, in 2023, the then Surgeon General basically said there's an epidemic of loneliness in the United States, and it's affecting people's physical health, not to mention their mental health, right? Excuse me, I got to change glasses. My print got too small, right? And this is challenging, and it's challenging in a way that I think is going to be particularly intriguing for our communal institutions, particularly synagogues, to address. What age group do you think has the highest expressed loneliness in the United States? Not rhetorical.
14 to 18.
14 to 18. 20 to 40. Now, old people are doing really well. Or not old, not the oldest, but yeah. Believe it or not, people between 30 and 44 are those that express the greatest amount of loneliness in the United States. Think about it. Think about what kind of cultural shifts are taking place that have been hard, especially for synagogues, to address. Older marriage, childlessness. What happens when somebody, a single woman, a single male, 35 years old, walks into your synagogue, walks into your communal institution? What are the first things you're going to ask that person? That's not rhetorical.
What's your name?
What's your name? What do you do for a living? Hey, are you married? Do you have any children? Right? Reasonable questions. I don't want to dismiss that. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable. But think about it. Think about our expectations of how the world is are so disconnected from the way they actually are and how we respond, right? Yeah, we traditionally have kind of looked at life cycle of people's kind of engagement with religious institutions. All right, they go away to college, they drop out, they don't show up. All right, about 25, 26, they get married. All right, I need to have a place to get married. I need a place for the chuppah, start connecting, have children, right? But what happens when that's not happening till people are 38, 39, or 40, right? We're not structured intellectually, let alone in terms of organizationally, to dealing with those challenges, right? When people need us are just the times that we, at least intellectually, at least mentally, may not be in a place to address what they need, right? Yeah, now the second biggest group is actually the group that's just younger than that, right? So you were hitting on something, right? But knowing what the kind of reality is going to be key to us thinking about how we ought to respond, right? What are we giving these people in terms of addressing a kind of major social and cultural need? I'm lonely. I need to connect. We talk constantly about building community. What do we do with it? What do we give people there? And how do we kind of make sure that they feel that they're going to be part of the community when we're kind of expressing by the very questions we ask them that their way of being in the world doesn't fit our expectations, right? And this is not new. I mean, I remember when evangelical Christian organizations had absolutely no way to deal with people that were divorced, right? Divorcee may show up in the pews. Everybody knew it, but had no way of dealing with it, right? Now things change, but you're not going to deal with the reality if you're not kind of understanding it and willing to do so. right? So can our organizations address the epidemic of loneliness to the extent both to which we're committed to creating community, and everybody talked about that, but also we're actually providing meaning to people's lives, right? What is the value you have? How do you kind of approach your way of being in the world? What can we give you to kind of give you a sense of purpose in this life? And we'll come back to purpose in a minute, right? Now, community has to be more than just people or folks who are in the same space with others. We have to create and maintain environments where individuals feel not only valued or important, but needed. So my question is, how does community look like within your Jewish organizations? What does it feel like? Is it a desire you have? Is it real or is it expressed? What does your community give and what does it expect from those involved with it? Right? Because being connected, being engaged isn't purely unidirectional, right? What do you bring to our community to make it stronger? Your presence is great, but how can you help us, right? Are we inviting people in that way in a very real sense, right? And I'm questioning that, not because I don't think we want to do it, but there are other issues that are kind of there. Meaning is important as well. In 2023, Harvard's Making Caring Common Project published a report that basically 58% of young adults, so people between the ages of 18 and 30, reported that they lacked meaning and purpose in their lives the previous. Half reported that their mental health was harmed by not knowing what to do with my life. But what it did find, young adults who belonged to a religious organization were more likely to report having meaning and purpose. Right? So we have something to offer. And we know this. I funded a major study with the Orthodox Union of B'nai Akiva. Right? They never done a study of their youth organizations. So does B'nai Akiva, especially leadership in B'nai Akiva, really affect kind of long-term outcomes of people's Jewish engagement? For the Orthodox rabbis in the office, the answer is yes, but very aggressively so, right? People who are leadership in B'nai Akiva are most likely to make aliyah, most likely to kind of continue into kind of Jewish leadership positions, most likely to marry other Jews, to be active, right? Because connections build and maintain connections, right? We were talking about, kind of talking about fundraising, right? Fundraising is all about relationship building and relationship maintenance, right? How are we expressing our care and concern for people around us, right? Because the challenge in terms of donation, either time, treasure, or talent, it is my alliteration. I came up with it. Everybody has stolen it. That's okay, I'm not bitter. But people's time, treasure, and talent, are we telling them that we actually do care? Right? Do we honor our volunteers as much as we honor our kind of big donors? How do we think about it? Right? Are we constantly telling people that are engaged with us or the people that are supporting us that they actually not only matter, but they're necessary? How do you give people things to do that are productive? Right?
Yeah. So I've seen a lot when people talk about being part of a religious community gives you a stronger outcomes in terms of purpose. And I've always wondered whether it goes the other direction, right? That people who are able to commit to a sense that there is purpose are the ones who are joining religious communities. And in part, it's self-forcing because, like the way you define it, right? Making aliyah and giving to Jewish institutions, marrying people who are Jewish. If that is your definition of purpose, right, then it's an achievable purpose, and you find that in religion. But if you find, for whatever reason, and there are plenty, that that's not the definition of purpose, then you have to find your way somewhere that isn't going to try to either define it that way or tell you, well, whatever it is, there's got to be some kind of link between finding yourself satisfied in a religious community and being able to name purpose.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to answer it conceptually, and then I'm going to give a kind of data point that's somewhat off, but I think analogically appropriate. I'm not saying that has to be the kind of source of purposes, right? Those results. It just basically said for this community, these things value people that are most engaged or people that kind of stay engaged, right? So there's that. One of the things I've been fighting with scholars about since the early 90s is this issue about giving, right? We know that people are kind of religiously committed, are basically much more engaged in kind of charitable giving across the board than people that aren't, right? And you get a lot of answers from certain scholars that basically, well, it's basically an issue of connections, right? If you're connected to a community, people are more likely to ask you to give. All right, I'm going to give, right? I mean, why my wife, contrary to everything she wants to do, is going to give to Chabad if they call up, right? Just because we were friends with the Chabad Rebbetzin in Indianapolis, and all right, like connections and connections. The answer to that answer always kind of says, yeah, but why is it people that are connected to religious institutions still giving more than people that are connected to other institutions, right? So there is a kind of something qualitative about that engagement, right? And not everybody who comes in stays, right? I think that's important. But how do we get people there, right? Right? People are searching for meaning. I will make that hard claim right now, right? Because they don't have it. What do we have to offer and give to those people who enter our institutions in that search, right? That's also why I want to get at in a minute, I hope, to the question of pluralism, right? Because every institution can't serve everybody. I hate to break it to you, right? But the value of kind of pluralism within the Jewish ecosystem, we can offer lots of options, right? And we're going to meet people different ways based on the particular mission of our organization, whether it's kind of organizational, whether it's kind of religious, whether it's my commitment to a phrase I hate, social justice, to kind of doing good things for folks. We have ways of kind of giving people meaning. But I want us to think about that way of giving people meaning as something other than merely kind of based on a consumer model. We've got some substance to give once people get into our institutions. And what that substance is may vary based upon the kind of mission of your particular organization, right? I mean, the norms of classical reform are going to be very different. And what I'm giving people in classical reform, even we're giving people the reality of classical reform, is going to be very different than a modern Orthodox synagogue or a Reconstructionist synagogue or somebody who's kind of committed to finding their Judaism in a social service organization, right? I was told I have to shut up in a minute. One of the things that I'm going to kind of talk about, the issue of financing came up a lot of ways. A book came out a few years ago called The Chosen Few, How Education Shaped Jewish History Between the Years 70 and the Years 1492. One of the arguments about it, the positive argument about it, is that basically the community's commitment to literacy, basically once the kind of modern world hit, industrialization hit, it gave Jews kind of ready entree into a commercial economy. But the downside was that Jews that were less literate actually dropped out. And in fact, they argue in the book that the striking decline in the size of the Jewish population between the years 100 and 500 and between the years 1200 and the end of the 15th century basically can be explained partially by the fact that Jews that were felt less Jewishly engaged and less literate basically went to other directions that were less demanding. Yes, persecutions, inquisitions, war, massacres played a part of role, but they do not, according to the authors of this book, account for the entire decline of the Jewish population in those periods. There was something that made Jews' numbers dwindle to religions that were less demanding than the costly requirements of educating children. I will invite you in my closing remarks that we're facing a similar issue today, but not literally, not in terms of literacy, but in terms of the fact that we're far too busy communicating to people that your Jewish life is something you buy. Giving in the Jewish institutions, the federations, is basically kept even with inflation. But what has changed is what's enabled those institutions to keep in par with inflation is not the number of donors, but they're increasing relying upon fewer and fewer large donors. If we communicate to our youth that Judaism and its value is something you buy, given the consumer model, there are lots of other things they can purchase. We have to think seriously about the fact that our Jewish communal life is something we build together and that we need everybody engaged in that building. Thank you.